Florida State in the SEC. Think about it. College football fans, this is what many of you have wanted for a long, long time. It's a fit. Think nothing else but football. Geography, history, level of play. Florida State through the years, the vintage Florida State in the SEC. Could you imagine? Wow, let's take a look right here at the Voice of College Football as we continue our series looking at particular programs and how they would fare in a new conference. And we're basing this on, of course, the reasonable realignment talk, considering a number of schools across the country that are being linked to new conferences. And of course, we've looked at Florida State against the Big Ten, Florida State in the SEC. Since the year 2000, Florida State has played 30 games against the SEC, 22 of those against the Gators. In 2022, they played the Gators, of course. Really good football game against a bad Florida team, 45-38. And there was the LSU opener that we will see once again here in 2023, this time in Orlando. Last season went right down to the wire, of course, with a blocked extra point, giving FSU the win. Before that, it was a lot of Florida Gators, and that series has gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, with an 11-11 tie. In other games against SEC teams, Florida State matched up against Bama in a number 1 versus number 3 game to start out the 2017 season. Of course, DeAndre Francois was hurt, and Bama rolled in the fourth quarter 24-7, a team that eventually went on to win the national championship. Another SEC opener in 2016 as Florida State took on Ole Miss and came back for a 45-34 win in that game. Go back 10 years to 2013, and we've got the most important matchup for Florida State in all its games against the SEC, defeating Auburn, coming back from 21-3 down to win the BCS championship with Jameis Winston at quarterback, 34-31 to complete an undefeated season. We see another bowl matchup against South Carolina in 2010 in the Chick-fil-A Bowl and a 26-17 Noles win. A Bama matchup in Nick Saban's first year in 2007 as the Noles won it over a 7-6 tie team, 21-14. A bowl matchup that particular season as Florida State took on the SEC 3 times. They lost to Kentucky, an 8-5 Wildcats team, 35-28 in the Music City Bowl. Then the other non-Florida matchup is against Georgia and Mark Richt, a Georgia team that finished number 3 in the polls after a 13-1 season, culminated with a 26-13 win over Florida State in the Sugar Bowl. In simply looking at the games against the Gators, it's been one of the great rivalries in college football, of course. Bobby Bowden against Steve Spurrier as we begin our run through the 2000s, and they traded blows back and forth. Then Urban Meyer took over at Florida, and it was a rough ride for the Noles against Urban Meyer in losing 5 consecutive games. They finally got Meyer in 2010 in one of his final games as the Noles rolled in that one 31-7, but before that, blasted by Urban Meyer's Florida Gators. Then we get past the Urban Meyer era. We work into Jimbo Fisher, who had pretty decent success against Florida, as you see wins there in 2011, also 2013 and 14 and 15 against the Florida Gators, and teams that would go on to play in the SEC championship game under Will Muschamp and Jim McElwain. Willie Taggart lost 2 games to the Gators, giving up 40 points in each game before Mike Norvell took over. Of course, there was a game canceled in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic and the adjusted schedule. Norvell is now 1-1 following a loss in 2021. Then he comes back with a win against another 6-7 Florida team, 45-38. The Florida State run in the 2000s has been just this. They entered the century as one of the elite programs in college football. They won the national championship in 99. They played for it in 2000. They got back to a Sugar Bowl in 2002 as the ACC champion, but they declined. They started to fashion 7-5, 8-4 kind of seasons in Bobby Bowden's final years in Tallahassee. Jimbo Fisher rallied the program. Of course, they won the Orange Bowl in 12. They won the national championship in 13. They got back to the playoff in 14 as an undefeated team in the regular season, but then they started to falter. They still had good teams in 15 and 16. Appearing in New Year's 6 bowl games. And then, of course, the Willie Taggart era was brutal. Mike Norvell's first couple seasons, brutal. So Florida State experiencing its worst football from 2017 through 2021. then going all the way back to the Bobby Bowden start in the mid-'70s, but the rally here in 2022 with 10 wins and a number 14 finish in the final poll this past season, and good things look to be ahead for Florida State football. So how would they compete in the SEC? Well, you would think vintage Florida State, vintage Bobby Bowden Florida State, and a sliver of Jimbo Fisher Florida State, and what could be on the horizon if they continue this upward trajectory would be classic, of course, to see Florida State knock heads with Alabama and LSU and the better Tennessee teams, and Florida, of course, when they have been at their best under Spurrier and Meyer, would have been phenomenal. We got slices of that against the Gators and then in some of the games that we highlighted in postseason play. However, the Florida State under the declining Bobby Bowden, of course, and based on what we've seen here in recent years, well, those Florida State teams that we had under Willie Taggart and early under Norvell would have been trampled by the SEC, of course. Now, what we're currently looking at right now, if they don't get any better, is going to be a Florida State team that's going to win about half its games in the SEC. That is going to get lost amongst the Kentuckys, Ole Misses, Mississippi States, and the like. They're going to be good teams, decent teams. Vintage Florida State, of course, that's the hope. That would be the optimism of Florida State fans entering the SEC with colossal matchups against the powers of the SEC, which would now include Texas and Oklahoma and anybody else that Florida State would bring with them from the ACC. It's fun to think about. It's a possibility. Maybe it happens in 2036 and beyond. Maybe the grant of rights collapses before that because there's enough of a contingent of ACC schools that rise up against the grant of rights. But this is simply the exercise of Florida State in the SEC. How would they fare? Your thoughts below, right here at the Voice of College Football.